Right now I'm drawing with an HB pencil. I would normally not draw with a pencil because it's full of pigment. Well, graphite is a pigment, and so I wouldn't want that interfering with the color. I have put down a base coat of yellow ochre and white, and you can see it's very little yellow ochre. This is white canvas up here and down at the bottom, and so it's just a hint of that color. And so once I've finished this drawing will survive to the final painting, because I'm going to top coat this with a clear medium, which I'm going to spray on after this drawing is done, and that's going to seal this drawing in. And then I'm going to use glazes to give this shape and form. We can color in some areas, and here the HB pencil doesn't really quite get it dark enough, so I will switch to a softer B pencil. Where I'm drawing right now is likely going to be behind trees, so I'm still drawing in there, but it's just so that I have some lines if I choose to alter that tree so it's not covering quite as much. Switching to a 7B right now, and we're just going to put in some darker tones. You can see the difference in value between the B pencil and the HB, but you can also see the texture quite a bit more. We're not too worried about that because we're going to be putting in a lot of dark glazes over top of this area. I'm going to switch back to the HB and do a little bit more. You can see in the reference that there's a lot of darks in this upper part, but I'm not going to put those in with the pencil. I'm going to keep that all for the glazes when I start coming down. Just separating out this piece. This is Old Baldy, and this piece of rock right here is actually not attached to the cliff face. There is you can walk in behind that when you're at the bottom. It's like a flower pot that you might see on Flower Pot Island. Only this is one heck of a... This piece is also not attached. It's calved away but still standing. A lot of times when a piece like this calves away from the main escarpment, it tumbles and falls down, but every once in a while the rock at its base is strong enough that it supports the weight. These rocks here are all in heavy shadow with just a little bit of highlight where the sun can get at the rocks. Most of them are heavily tree covered. Gotta be careful not to lay move my hand across the canvas, because until I fix this with the medium, I can easily smudge this drawing, especially the 7B. The HB pencil is a lot better for doing these fine cracks. That would actually be incredibly time consuming to do with rigor. Not incredibly, but somewhat time consuming. Watch, I'm not making anything too repetitive. I'm looking at the reference the whole time I'm doing this. Not worrying about trying to copy that reference exactly, but just trying to get an idea of the way this rock is fractured and cracked. Just going to darken this line up a little bit, because this line is where it goes from shadow to light. When you're putting the medium on, it's probably better to use a matte medium. A semi-gloss would be okay, but you don't want to use a gloss, just because when you start working on that, the glazes are going to slide a little bit too much on the gloss. Definitely matte is preferred. So you can use these much cheaper spray bottles, but they don't seem to give as much of a mist. So I prefer to use the slightly more expensive dollar store sprayers. And why you have to keep that in mind is chances are it won't work after you've done this, even if you clean it well. Every once in a while you can clean it well enough, but you want to have a very light spray at first, because if you put too much down there, it's going to start to bleed. So I think we'll let that dry, and I'm going to give it successive coats until I feel like I've got a complete coverage of that. I allowed that to dry overnight. When I sprayed this with the medium, it was a glazing medium that I used, thinned down. It had a little bit of a pebbling from the spray, and so I sprayed it with water just to help self-level of that after. And you'll see that now this is not only is this smooth, but it doesn't matter how much I rub it, I'm not smearing that pencil. So that graphite, which is a pigment, is completely locked in. So now we're going to do some glazing. I don't think we're going to use that brush. I use one of my favorite 3/8 brushes, 3/8 flat. So we're going to mix up a little bit of ultramarine blue and white. And I'm not using a lot of white here, so I'm not too concerned. I could use zinc white. I'm using titanium white. Zinc white is a little bit more transparent, so if you have any concerns, you might want to switch to that. So I'm going to glaze the shadow side of the rock to start with. So we're just going to come out here. That's a little bit too heavy, so we're going to take some of that off, because we want to still be able to see the line drawing underneath. We don't need to worry about that up there, because that will all be covered. And so I'm just using water now, just thinning that down. And again, I'm coming way below, because that will all be covered in trees. And I'm going to take some of that off. Now you can see that it's pooling a little bit in the texture, and so we can take a dry brush and we can softly pull that out of that texture, and it's sort of taking some of that paint off, but it's until that really starts to dry that's going to continue to pool, and so you just keep using that brush to pull that out of the texture. This is all going to not make a big difference over here because we're going to be putting a much darker glaze over this portion of the painting once we get that. So I'm just taking some of that off now. I'm going to put, I think I'm going to actually, we're going to be putting dark glaze on this side as well. So this is, I think I'm going to try the rigger here. And these are just, we're just going to hit some of these sort of much smaller shadow areas. A lot of this is getting shadowed by the canopy of cedars above. What's interesting about the escarpment is that it's mostly cedars that live on the edge. In fact, some of them that are growing out of the cliff face are some of the oldest trees in Ontario, aging as high as 1,700 years. And it was quite a surprise. It was only relatively recently discovered, but they're so slow growing and they escape fires and logging and whatnot just by being in very awkward places to get to. Not that they would make great trees, because these are real gnarly cedars that have managed to survive through the ages. So I'm just mixing up some dark green. I'm just going to start painting the trees in while I'm waiting for that glaze to dry. So we'll start at the top, and we're starting with the dark first. This is just sort of to define where the main shadows are. It's not going to look much like a tree here at first. That blue is just about, you can see when blue's been down on the palette too long, it starts to congeal, but we can still make that work because we're too lazy or too thrifty to change. So we're going to take this. This is the shadow that we'll be putting the lighter green on top of. Doesn't look like much at the moment. I never know, it might not look like much when I'm done, but we're hoping. I'm using a rigger here, but the 3/8 brush would probably be better. But so these shadows are getting a little bit repetitive in their distance. So we're just going to turn that into one larger shadow. give that a little bit more saturation. Cedar trees are not exactly a bright green tree. We're going to be bringing this down into the rock, but I think we'll be waiting a little bit longer for that. Now, I'm not worried too much about developing the top edges of these because I will be negative painting sky down into that. So this, we're really just blocking in the colors here. So I've added a little bit more ultramarine blue there. That's a little fresher and a little easier to use. Sometimes my own thriftiness works against me. But we're taking a little bit more time with these trees down here because we're not going to be painting negatively into them. Not going to get into too much fine detail. We just don't want to overpaint the cliff face and have to come back and restore. I mean, there's nothing that we can't come back and restore if we have to, but it's a little bit better if we don't have to do that. So when I'm painting the trees, I'm just keeping in mind that the cedar trees in here are conical in nature, and so we just want to give them a little bit of shape and form. Sometimes they can be a little formless in nature, depending on the lighting. If you have dramatic lighting from the side, they can look quite good, but these aren't too bad. It's a nice sunny day with some light coming from the side. This is actually going to be this picture was taken in the early winter, and so all the leaves are off. These are likely birch, because amongst the cedars around the escarpment, birch is the next one that's most common there. A lot of the other species can't quite survive the drought periods that are often around the rocks as the water drains away. But, so I'm not going to take that up too high just yet. We'll do that a little later. And we'll just add a little bit more detail. Okay, so just going to pull a little bit of that green up there. We're going to be adding a fair number of different greens yet. Later, but this is really just to block some of the colors down. One of the things that you'll notice is that as I've added, even though these are fairly nondescript trees, they have done a lot for saying rock. It's often when you're looking for the udder in something like rock, it's not always the rock itself, it's the things that surround it. One expects to see rock around trees as opposed to beach balls or something like that. GoPro, stop recording. So I've got the canvas on a tilt because I want this to run down. We're doing the dark glazes that are initially coming from the contaminants in the soil above the rock and often the iron in the rock. This rock isn't showing a lot of orange from the iron, but we will put some of that in just for the hell of it. But initially we're starting off with a dark, which I'm mixing from the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. It doesn't work with the phthalo blue because the burnt sienna will go green, and especially when you're using it as a glaze. Now I'm using water as the glaze medium, and I very rarely use glazing medium. And I've done a video on why I do that you can watch rather than going into length here. So I put that on fairly thick, and now I can just sort of drag. This is a clean wet brush, and I'm just dragging that color down. And it's a good idea to have a paper towel ready to catch any excess coming off there. I think we're going to take a little bit of that off there. And so one of the things I like to let that drip down is it looks very, because that looks very natural. That's what's actually happening in the on the rock itself. The rain water is dripping down that. So I'm coming in, getting this whole rock quite a bit darker. So the dark pencil marks that I was putting in with the 7B pencil really are starting to fill in and look a little bit more natural. So I'm going to let that, well, maybe not, just not yet. We're just going to come down. And so one thing about this, if you do want a very specific glaze, I'll just do a sample on this side, is if you put a wet line down and then you come in with paint, it's going to follow. See how that took that curve? So you can control this to some extent. You're not going to get it to go back uphill again, but we... mix up a little bit more of that. I might actually have to break down and put some more ultramarine down. So this is pretty thick paint, really almost not a glaze, but we are going to be thinning that down by using a clean brush. And then we can get in there and move that around, soften the edges. We don't want to lose everything we've drawn in there. I think I'm just going to expose. And the nice thing about using a paper towel to lift some of that is we're getting some nice random marks of that underlying glazed surface. That's one of the things that defeats a lot of rocks when people are painting them, is they look very contrived. And so we're trying to avoid that. We're not too worried about getting it on the trees here, as that was really just blocking them in. So I think we're going to just put a little bit as shadow work along the top there. So you put the paint down and then you move it around with a clean, damp brush. Do not worry about all the Kool-Aid drinkers that tell you not to use. Stop, GoPro, stop recording. So don't worry about those people telling you not to use water in acrylics. You can see this was water lately. That paint is locked in beautifully. It's not going anywhere. I much prefer using the water as a glaze than glazing medium. It's a lot easier to control. It dries faster. And you can come in much quicker. like I'm doing now, where I'm coming in, making that glaze darker. Even though it's only had a few minutes to dry, it is quite well locked in. And so this is using acrylics, very much like you might work in watercolor. Only thing is, when this dries, it's not going anywhere. You don't have to put glass in front of it, or it's completely locked in. And if you're just a worrywart by nature, you can always top coat this with a clear medium, and like I did with the graphite pencil marks, lock that right into the canvas so that it's never going anywhere. And one of the things you may often hear is about varnishing a painting after it's done. Acrylic is one of the toughest materials. They've stopped using oil paint on houses because acrylic paint is so much tougher. And so if you do need to top coat a painting, use an acrylic medium to top coat it. Tri-Art Paints has a final finish, which is what I choose to use if I need something a little bit beyond the regular acrylic. Most times I'm putting a varnish on to even out gloss, not because it needs protection. With oil paint, it's not a matter of, forget that, cut. Going to switch to a #1 rigger, and we're just going to do some of the finer details. I think I might mix up a little bit more of that paint first, though. So this paint is very thin, which is ideal for getting fine lines out of a rigger. So we're just going to, there's a lot of paint on here, which is okay because we're not quite doing fine lines yet. So I'm taking this rigger and I'm just using it sideways to smear like I was with the larger brush. So we're just taking some of that paint off before we come in. And the one thing I like about doing this is you really want to be fairly random with this, so it's not something, I guess I always get a little bit bored if I have to do something super precise. I like the freewheeling feel of just random marks. So what I'm doing now is I've taken all the paint off of that brush, and so I'm just going, there's a puddle of paint there, and I'm just pulling out from that puddle of paint. There's lots of crigs and crags up here, so I'm using the pencil marks as a guide. So sometimes the pencil marks get completely covered, and other times they are out there to be seen. So using the brush sideways just to pull that paint down. On the larger painting, when I'm trying to get this paint to drip down, I may actually spray water directly on the surface to get a little bit more drip action, but this is such a small painting that it's really a little bit overkill to spray water, so I try to do it with the brush alone. And the nice thing, if you don't like what you've done, you can always just go in and wipe it off. And I'm using that rigger on the side, mostly because I want to make sure I'm getting very random marks. I don't want to get too contrived, no matter how, well, when you're looking there, it's very hard to not let your brain take over and let it paint what it thinks it sees, because it never does see too accurately. Not never, but often. Just rolling my sleeve up there. So I'm coming in with the blue that I was using to do the larger shadows, and I'm just doing a little bit of detail in this side. This is a very fractured piece of escarpment on this side. And one of the things that typically I do err on trying to have horizontal marks, but this is a limestone cliff made up of tiny sea creatures over millions of years. The age of the escarpment ranges from about 900 million years to, I don't know, maybe a million years, maybe a couple million. So this is some of the earliest stuff was formed before there were creatures on land, and it went right through the Jurassic with those super huge dinosaurs walking around. So, but it built up in layers, because the central part of North America was an inland sea. And so these layers often cause the rock to fracture that way, but the very top has had magnesium penetrate into the rock, which makes the rock a lot more solid, which is why we don't get quite as much layering in some of the top. In fact, if you didn't have this, it's called dolomite once it's been magnesiumized. I don't know what the right term there is. but it's that gives us the waterfalls. We have 17, I think, waterfalls around this area. You need the hard cap rock at the top to create a waterfalls and the softer rock underneath. So this is very thin. It's looking a little bit repetitive there, so I'm just going to smudge that a bit to take some of that away. And I think we might come in with our I'm going to get into a slightly darker color to do some of these crigs and crags down the bottom. Hardly any paint left there, but when you're using so much water, you really don't need a heck of a lot. Okay, I'm just going to come and do this again. I don't think we got enough run down there. One of the things that's really nice about this graphite technique is most times when you're drawing in an acrylic painting, it's a waste of time because it gets lost so early in the painting process. You do all this beautiful drawing and then you're filling it in and it's gone. I really don't like if you start coloring in. Coloring usually doesn't have, it has a little bit of a contrived look, I think, but certainly some people can make it successful. We've gone to that blue color again. I like to use blue a lot rather than like a true gray, as it certainly makes the rock much more interesting color-wise. Certainly when you look at the reference, you can see a blue cast to it, but not as blue as what I've done. And that is intentional. It's not a matter of me being colorblind. So there's lots of microchips and cracks through this lit area. This is a, I think I've said before, this is Old Baldy in the Beaver Valley in Ontario. And it's such that I've gone back to this several times to get the right lighting on this rock. And I've done some very large paintings of this rock where I've actually taken a series of shots with my good friend Rob Stewart, who has a super zoom camera, so we could shoot this across the valley and get some real detailed shots. So it's just so I could really see this rock. I don't want to do too much more to that, and I'm just going to blot some of that off just to quieten it down a bit. I want that, a fair amount of that yellow to show through. So I'm just going to do a little bit more of the dark over here. So I was really stretching that paint, so we'll mix up a little bit more. And then I'm going to show you a little bit of the rust color. There's really isn't, there might be a little bit coming in through there in the reference, but we're going to put a bit more. GoPro, stop recording. So I'm mixing actually a very dark green to reinforce the shadows in the trees. So this is burnt sienna and the phthalo blue. So we're going to come in here. Whenever you're painting something like trees, it's always nice to use a variety of color. Don't just mix 2 or 3 colors. Have those colors move around as much as you can. So we're going to start putting some of these trees growing out of the face of the rock. So we're just starting with the darkest shadow. There's quite a few on this case. I don't know if I'm going to put as many as there actually are. They are a very tough tree. These are eastern white cedar. Certainly don't get to the size of the western cedars or anywhere near the size of those trees. but they make up for it in toughness. I'll mix up a little bit more of that. You can get a number of different greens by just changing the percentage of burnt sienna to phthalo blue. In this particular case, you don't really see much of the difference because it's so dark. It actually makes a lovely black, which is these really are damn close to black. So we're just going to indicate a couple of not sure what I'm going to do with this tree here right now, so we'll leave that, but just got to put a little bit of the trees coming. I don't like the way those two are lining up, so we'll we're going to come in and get quite a bit lighter. So we're going to throw in a little bit of white into that green. Cedars are not a real vibrant green, so I want to be careful not to go too over the top with this. But I think that looks like a pretty good cedar green. I mean, certainly there's no reason why you have to stick to the actual colors. Like I've seen red trees, blue trees. It's whatever's going to work in the painting, but this is fairly representational, so I'm not going too far out into left field with these. and a little bit of the darker paint that's still wet, and so that's sort of good because it's giving me additional colors without having to work for it. I love not having to work for something. Painting a lot looser up here as the trees are. I'm going to be painting a lot of negative painting into that. Putting a lot of burnt sienna into this, just I want a different dark, but I don't want it, the burnt sienna is going to make a more desaturated green, which I think will look, so I'm just coming back over top of this one to make that paint a little bit thicker so it's not transparent. Okay, I've turned the painting upside down just to put the sky a little bit closer to me. I'm just going to paint negatively in the sky. So the sky color, I think we're going to use mostly a phthalo blue. In fact, I think we'll probably just use entirely a phthalo blue. So, and that's to pick up the phthalo blue that we've used in the rock shadows. So I think we just need to mix up a little bit more. I'll just show you how reckless I can be with using lots of paint. So as the phrase goes, that looks about the right value, but it's going to dry darker, so we're going to make that a bit lighter. So I think that should be enough. So we're going to use the very small rigger to do the finer work, but we're going to do the broad strokes with this 3/8 brush. And I'm using up the paint on the brush. Just wipe some off on the top there. Just as the brush gets less paint on it, we can cut in a little nicer. So just coming in with the corner. A lot of times when negative painting, I try to leave some of the background, but in this case, we're not interested in any of that background showing through. So I've turned that the right way around, and it's definitely nice to paint it right side up. It's less struggle on your brain having to reverse things. I'm just coming in. I see little bits of the background showing through there, so we just want to take those out. The unevenness in color you're seeing there is just the different rates that the paint is drying. The lighter is still wet,